Hi there, I'm Jean Ann Wright, and I design trim tools for creative grids to make strip piece blocks from log cabin to pineapple, hexagon, and curvy log cabin. I've been teaching classes in these blocks all over the United States for the past 3 years, and my class people have asked many questions during the class on using the tools, and I thought I would share these tips and tricks with you so that you can have the benefit of a class right at home. So first of all, I'd like to tell you the rulers I've designed. The original was a traditional log cabin, and it makes a log cabin block like this for this quilt. And all of the tips and tricks apply to every ruler. The next ruler I designed was another log cabin that does 6 and 12-inch blocks. After that, I did a pineapple trim tool. And so for that, I did pineapple blocks. And the tool does 6, 8, and 10-inch blocks. Again, the tips and tricks I'm going to show you apply to this ruler as well. The next ruler I did was the hexagon trim tool. And with this tool, we can do a hexagon block. And you can see how we can strip piece the traditional hexagon and what they call a hexagon pineapple. So this tool does that. Plus it cuts 2, 4, 6, and 8-inch hexagons. My next tool after that was the 8-inch curvy log cabin block, and that makes 2 different types of blocks. One is the star block, as you can see the white, and the other is a circle block, as you can see by this table runner. These are the 2 Zen table runners. So this block was so popular that we decided to do a 6-inch curvy. The nice thing about this is when you sew 4 of them together, you can have all variations of drunkard's path blocks, which is what I've been doing lately. So this is a 6-inch drunkard path block quilt, and this is my ice cream cones, which is another 6-inch block. I have quilts behind me. The rainbow swirls is the 6-inch, and the carousel is the 8-inch curvy. Now I'm going to demonstrate this morning with the 8-inch curvy to show you the tips and tricks. But remember, these tips and tricks apply to every ruler that I make, the same tips and tricks. So the first thing on any ruler, and it will be printed right on the ruler, the size of blocks, center squares you need to make that. And this is the traditional ruler. So now I've got to get the curvy. The first thing to remember for all of the tools is the only thing that you need to precision cut is your center square. And for this one, it's marked right on the ruler. It says cut your center squares 1 3/4 inches. So I cut a number of these. And each ruler will tell you which size to cut your center squares. A frequently asked question is, can I chain piece? The answer to that question is yes. And you can see that I've chain pieced 4 center squares down this strip. Now the strips that you need to sew with are always longer and wider than you need. You will notice that this one has on one side pinking, and it's also unevenly cut. One side of your strip needs to be rotary cut evenly. The other side can be anything because you're going to trim that off later. So once you've chain pieced your 4 in a row, you can either take your scissors and cut them apart like this, or you can use a rotary cutter, and I like my rotating mat, and you can just slice them between. You notice I've left about a 1/2 inch in between, and I'm just going to slice them apart like this, okay, because you want everything to be a little bit oversized. So after I sew those pieces, this is what they're going to look like, and I finger pressed it on a log cabin block or pineapple or hexagon. You always press both seam allowances towards the outside edge. So this is the center square, and this would be the outside edge. So this is my first little unit. Now I'm ready to sew my next strip. And in order to sew that strip, I add it to here, lining up with the center square, and then the rest just falls in place. Now I like to use what I call a placeholder pin to hold it in place while I'm sewing. And I sew it by putting the edge of my presser foot, which I have set my presser foot and my needle so I get a scant 1/4 inch seam, right along the strip that I'm adding, ignoring this leftover piece from before. So I'm going to sew right along there. And so now I'm going to have 2 pieces sewn in place, and I'm ready to add my next strip, which on the curvy is a narrow. So on this one, you can see, there's my pin. I've sewed 1/4 inch right along my strip, leaving this little extra piece left over. I will then remove my pin, finger press it out, and add my 4th piece. And there's my 4th piece. So now this is ready to trim. So I'm going to take my trim tool. Now there's some things that I always do alike. I've been told that's called standardization. So I always trim my light sides first and then my dark, no matter which ruler I'm using. That way I can always remember where I am in case the dog barks or the phone rings and I have to leave my work and come back. I don't have to say to myself, where am I? So I'm going to show you. I trim up and I trim across using the markings for narrow round 1. Every ruler is marked with which centering square to use. Then I'm going to turn it around and use the ruler markings for wide round 1 because I've just added 1 round of strips. And I'm going to trim it again. When I do that, it's now perfectly sized. So that's my first round. Now I'm going to add another round of strips all the way around. And people say, where do I start on the next round to add the strips? When you get to the next round, you're always going to be sewing across 2 seam allowances. So you'll notice on this, there's only one side that has 2 seam allowances, and that's right here. You see this side has 1 seam, this side has 1 seam, but this side has 2 seams. So we're going to add our next strip across the 2 seams. And on the curvy rulers, you're going to be adding wide to wide and narrow to narrow. So I added across 2 seams here, and then I had 2 seams here, then I had 2 seams here, and lastly I had 2 seams here. So this is my round 2. Again, I'm going to trim my narrow first, and then I will trim my wide. And I will turn it around so that I'm not trimming towards my body. You never want to trim towards your body. So when this one is trimmed, you will now have a perfect round 2. And the beauty of this ruler is you're using oversized strips to sew on, and then you trim them to size afterwards. So if your seam allowance is a little off, we all have days when our sewing machine just doesn't want to do the right thing, you're correcting that little imperfection when you trim. So now you have to do your 3rd turn around, and here it is again. So I trim my light sides first. Now the center square is marked, so you put the center square on the center square of your block. You line it all up, and then I trim 2 sides. This is the part I like the most. We all have to get our little thrills somewhere, you know. And for me, it comes when I can twirl my mat. I use a rotating mat, and then I rotate it around. It came out of its little socket. And then I trim the other 2 sides without moving the block or the ruler, so that when I'm done, every block is exactly, on this one, 8 1/2 inches. So that's the tips and tricks to do. Remembering, one other thing that I have to tell you is you always sew in the same direction. When I started, I was adding my strips in a clockwise direction. So you can see here's my center square, and for me staring at this, it's clockwise, 1, 2, 3, 4. Always going clockwise. If you're a left-handed person, you may find it easier to always sew counterclockwise. It doesn't make any difference if you sew clockwise or counterclockwise, but you just want every block in the same quilt to be sewn in the same direction. And I always sew clockwise for all my quilts because that's what's most natural to me, and then I never have to think, am I sewing this quilt clockwise or counterclockwise? I just know I always have to sew in a clockwise rotation. So there are other tools that I like to have. Of course, my rotating mat is my favorite because it's a lot of fun to rotate. But for many of my tools, you'll find that a jelly roll will provide the fabrics that you need. when it says to cut it at least 2 1/4, you can easily use a 2 1/2 inch jelly roll strip and eliminate cutting. Another tool that I like to use, or another way to buy fabric, is to buy a fat quarter pack. I mean a layer cake pack. I also use fat quarter packs because these are already coordinated and ready to sew. And I don't like to spend a lot of time coordinating things. Other rulers that I like to use is I have this 60-degree triangle ruler, and it works with the hexagon ruler very well. If you want to add triangles to your hexagon layout, you can add it using this ruler, and you don't have to play with moving your straight edge ruler to get your 60-degree mark. This just does it for you perfectly. Lately, another new tool from Creative Grids is the Stripology ruler. And this is brand new, and I love this for cutting my strips because honestly, I don't like to think about what I'm doing. When I'm ready to make a quilt, I do not want to pre-cut, and I don't want to do any math, and I don't want to do any measuring. And with my tools, I've done all of that for you. Stripology does the cutting for you. This is marked with 1/2 inch increments, and your little rotary cutter fits. There's a little slit here, and your rotary cutter will fit right in there and cut across fat quarters and yardages. Most of my quilts I either cut at, for all of them now, I'm cutting 1 1/2, 2, or 2 1/2 inch strips. And the cool thing about the Stripology is that it has squares at the 2 1/2 inch mark, all marked for you, so you know you just have to hit that square to cut that 2 1/2 inch width. And the stars are 1 1/2 inch. And of course the 2s, that's math I can do, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I think I learned that in first grade. So if you want to cut your strips, you can cut up to 8 layers at a time with this, because my whole thing is I don't want to do a lot of time in prep work. I just want to sit down and start to sew. So that's all of my tips and tricks. You can see how easy they are, not complicated at all. It makes using the rulers easy and fun, and I hope you'll make lots and lots of strip piece quilts. Thank you.